What is up, Facebook land? Welcome to another edition of the Two Dates and a Dash podcast. I'm your host, Matt Cubbler, and my special guest tonight is someone I really admire. His name's Russell Peltz, full name J. Russell Peltz. He is a legendary Philly boxing promoter. But before we get to him, first of all, I want to dedicate the show. There's his lovely wife there, if you can see her. I want to dedicate the show to Gabe Rosado, to Kermit Cintron, to every fighter who's gone through the rigors of being a professional boxer, amateur or professional, and knows what it's like to get their head beat in for a couple $100 in hopes that one day they get a shot at winning a world title. It's a tough business. It's not a very clean business at times, but I dedicate this show to every boxer that's ever laced up the gloves and stepped in the ring. You can listen to the podcast on all the normal podcast places, iTunes, Stitcher, Anchor, Google Podcast. Everywhere you find a podcast, you can listen to the show. Just a little bit of history on Russell. Russell's been a promoter for coming up on 50 years. He was the promoter for many famous Philly fighters and many famous fighters all around the world. If I'm not mistaken, he was Marvelous Marvin Hagler's promoter for a while. And he just put on so many amazing fights back in the day of the Blue Horizon, the Spectrum. Now he's at 2300 Arena. You name it, he's put on shows all around the area with some of the greatest fighters and fights ever in the history of boxing. And he's a walking encyclopedia. He's a Hall of Famer. He is the man to know anything about the sweet science. So without further ado, my good man and my good friend, Russell Peltz. How are you, brother?
Great. Looking forward to the show, Matt.
It's going to be fun. So not everybody that watches my show knows boxing. I love boxing. It's my favorite sport out of all the sports in the world. Boxing is my favorite because it's so much of a mixture between intellect, of strategy, of tactics, of skill, of strength, of speed, of conditioning. It's all the things that I find intriguing is why I love boxing. You've been doing it for 50 years. Let's go back to 50 years ago when you decided to get into boxing. How did that start? How did you decide I'm going to become a boxing promoter and turn it into a Hall of Fame career?
Oh, I didn't know I was going to turn it into a Hall of Fame career. I remember the girl I was dating who became my first wife at the time. We were having dinner one night at Penn's campus at Pagano's, and she said to me, what makes you think you can do this? And we were like, I guess we were juniors, or I was probably a junior or senior at Temple. And I lived at home and I was working full time at the Bulletin on the night shift. So I had saved up about $5,000. This is back in 1969. So I said, you know what? It'll take me about 6 months to blow the 5,000. And I'll have this great scrapbook to show our kids one day of the time their daddy was a boxing promoter. So, I fell in love with the sport when I was 12, and I can't really figure out why. Maybe it was vicarious. It wasn't like I was the toughest kid in the neighborhood. I grew up on the main line, but I just started. My dad wasn't a big sports fan. The only sport that he ever even remotely talked about was boxing because his dad was a boxing fanatic, but he died when I was like 3 or 4 years old. He used to run wires for Western Union from the big fights in Philly. So I started watching the Friday night fights in 1959. The first one that I remember was Carmen Basilio against Gene Fulmer from the Cow Palace in San Francisco in August of 59. And I started watching them by myself. He'd come around. My dad he'd come into the room and say, what ham and eggers are you watching now? And so I figured what a ham and egger was. It was a guy that wasn't that good. And years later, I learned the actual definition of a ham and egger, which was a guy who had to fight to make enough money so he could buy a ham and egg breakfast the next day.
Wow.
This was how the old timers talked. And my mom was against it. She hated it. She didn't want her mainline bred son hanging around the fight mob. But I whined and begged my father, so as a present for my 14th birthday, he took me to my first live fight, which was December 4th, 1960 at Convention Hall, you know, where the Warriors used to play.
Yep.
And I wore a tie and jacket because in those days, if you sat ringside, if you look at the old films, everybody wore ties and jackets. I thought I was the coolest kid on the block because I was going to the fights. And when we walked in there that night to Convention Hall, and I can see it today. I saw that ring. And in those days, the smoke that was over the ring, I fell in love. I mean, I said, this is going to be part of my life forever. And honestly, until I got to high school, the only black people I ever came into contact with were the women who cleaned our houses, or my dad was a plumber and his top mechanic, Jimmy Williams, was a black man, and one of his drivers was black, but that was it. And there were no blacks in my elementary school, in junior high. It wasn't until I got to Lower Merion, and you're still talking about less than 5%. And I saw, you know, and then you stand next to someone, you want to say something to him, and he starts speaking Spanish, which I'd never heard in my life. And it was just a whole new world for me. And we sat on the second row, and I could give you a rundown of the whole show. And I just was hooked. And it was always number one, but in high school and college, I got hooked on college basketball. And I went to college for journalism. And in the summer between my junior and senior year, I mean, I was the editor and all that stuff at Temple. We had a daily paper. I got a full-time job at the Bulletin. I'd work midnight to 8. I go home and go to sleep at 9. And then in August, late August of that year, between my junior and senior year, Jackie Wilson, he was the sports editor at the Bulletin. I was getting ready to leave the shift and go home. And he said, Russell, your senior year is starting now. We'll keep you on Saturday nights, go back to school, get your diploma, and you'll come back. I don't know, I always get emotional here. You'll come back to work with us when you graduate. I'll tell you, I thought somebody had shot me with ice. You know, you get that cold feeling. Yeah. And so I looked at him, and I remember exactly where he stood in the sports room. I said, Mr. Wilson, I'll work for nothing. That's how much I enjoyed what I was doing at the Bulletin. Not writing that much, but editing copy, doing page layouts. I remember I was the makeup editor the day Temple won the NIT, when the NIT still meant something. So he looked at me with his Mona Lisa smile, and he said, forget it, you'll stay on. So I worked midnight to 8, and then I went to Temple from 9 to 1, and then I went home and went to sleep. And then I started all over again. And I got the award as the Outstanding Male Journalism Graduate at Temple. And I went away into the reserves, the Army, for 6 months. And when I got out, I went back to the Bulletin, and my goal was to be the boxing writer. And the boxing writer at the Bulletin was Jack Freed, who also wrote under the name of Matt, M-A-T-T, Ring. And he'd been at the Bulletin forever. But they had mandatory retirement in those days, and he was 65, and he got an extension on his retirement. And I said to myself, what am I going to do, wait around for this guy to die? So, but when you're 22 and you had $5,000 saved up in the bank, because I lived at home, I didn't have a lot of expenses. I was making money at the Bulletin, and I had made money as an editor of the Temple News. So you can do things like that when you're young. So I told Jackie Wilson, I said, I'm leaving. I'm going to become a boxing promoter. Well, they thought it was hilarious.
I'm sure.
They thought, you know, I found a memo that was on somebody's desk a couple weeks later, and the signature, I guess it was about me, but I just saw the signature at the bottom. The signature was Russell B. period back. Russell be back, meaning I was going to be back. That boxing, I wouldn't make it in boxing. And, you know, when you work the midnight shift at the Bulletin, you have a lot of free time because deadline is 6 a.m. and I'm getting in there at midnight. So I'd spend a lot of time in what they call the Bulletin morgue, which is the library, where they have every single story and every single photo that ever appeared in the history of the Bulletin. And that the Bulletin was the oldest afternoon paper in existence in the world. So I'd go in there and look up all the boxing stories, especially the ones about the Blue Horizon. And I would make these long lists. What night of the week, who fought, how many people were there, what was the gross gate, what was the net gate, because the old writers, they used to put all that stuff. I'd see a guy ran on Thanksgiving Eve and he got destroyed, the promoter. So I studied this, and I had written some stories when the boxing writer was on vacation. And I got friendly with Pat Duffy, who was the head of the Middle Atlantic Amateurs and who was a silent partner in the management of Bennie Briscoe. And he would funnel the top amateurs to his partner, Penny Schaefer, who was the head of the Bartenders Union. And I got friendly with them. And even though I had wanted my boyhood idol, Harold Johnson, to fight on my first card, he was the ex-world light heavyweight champ. He was too expensive, so they gave me Bennie Briscoe for $1,000 against 25% of the gate. And I went to the Blue Horizon. I had met Jimmy Toppy, who owned it and had been in boxing his whole life. And even though he was nice to me, he was quoted as saying he thought I was a kid with delusions of grandeur. So I was fortunate enough to get a guy to fight Benny who had beaten him a couple years earlier by the name of Tito Marshall, although he was over the hill by now. And I made that fight. And I had gotten friendly in college with Tom Cushman when he came east from Colorado to get the gig at the Daily News. We met in Oklahoma City during a Temple basketball tournament. And he helped me immeasurably, because if it hadn't been for Cushman, I would have never made it, because the writers at the other papers, and, you know, sue me if you want, including Jack Freed, they took money. It's a time-honored thing in boxing that writers always took money from promoters, even guys like Damon Runyon, to get publicity in the paper. And Cushman, he fell in love with the idea that a 22-year-old kid was going to start promoting fights. And Freed and whatever, the guys at the other papers, I remember coming into the Bulletin, just to digress, one day, and there was a wrestling story about a small match at the arena the night before, and we were tight on space, so I cut it out. I said, who cares about, 5 sentences or 5 paragraphs in a wrestling story? A filler. So the boxing writer came in and looked through the paper, because in those days we used to have 5 or 6 editions, like Phillies lead Milwaukee 5-3 after 6 innings. You'd buy it at the ballpark. And he went crazy. He said, where's the wrestling story? I said, I took it out. I said, we didn't have room. What's the big deal? Well, he went bananas. He ran downstairs to the composing room, pulled the lead type out of the trays, and put the wrestling story back in for a later edition. So I said to a guy named Lou King, who was the makeup editor, I said, Lou, why is he so upset? He said, because the wrestling promoter pays him to put that in the paper. And so, it was a time-honored tradition in boxing, and Cushman knew this. And he told me before the first show, he said, if I ever find out that you gave money to those other guys, I'm out. But I was a journalism major. I couldn't even think about paying guys off to write stories. I said, Tom, it's never going to happen. And before my first show, the guy who covered boxing for the Inquirer, he wrote this big column, and the headline was, is Peltz ready to get skinned? Ooh. And then one of their stories says, Blue Horizon. Blue Horizon show. It was supposed to say Blue Horizon show marks return of local boxing, but there was a typo. They left the K out, so it said Blue Horizon show mars the return of local boxing. That was probably an accident. I'd like to think it was, but we sold out. We turned people away the first night. It was the largest crowd at that time ever at the Blue Horizon, and we charged $3 and $5. I made $1,500 that night. And at the end of the first season, which was September of 69 to May of 70, 7.5 months, 15 shows, I made the same $7,500 that I was making at the Pullman. I was having a better time.
Well, let me ask you this. So you went through this, you're literally, I mean, I could listen to you talk boxing all night long, just the history of it, because of the clarity in which you can remember things. I mean, I just think it's amazing, the names and the details that you just have locked away in that vault of yours you call a brain. I love it. So you've been in boxing now for 50 years. You've seen what it was in the 1960s. You came from the main line into the city. You began promoting. You have this journalism background, so you understand how to tell a story, which boxing is. And people don't understand that. When you do when a matchmaker makes a fight, you want a story to be told with that fight. You don't want to have some guy that's a horrible matchup for another guy and it's an ugly fight. You got to be able to have a good storyline behind each fight. And did you find that being a writer, being a journalism major, helped you be a better fight maker, a better promoter, a better spinner of facts when it comes to the boxers?
Well, spinner of facts is a little no. I don't know how we can talk on. I don't know. I've never been a good BSer. It's just not me. Like I said to you before we got on the air, people born round don't die square. I love that quote. I would lose out on fighters because I would tell them I couldn't tell a fighter that he fought like Archie Moore when he really fought like Archie Bunker. I just couldn't. I couldn't do that. And I'd see these other guys putting their arms. Oh, I'm going to make you champ. I always tell it like it is. Sometimes to my detriment, but I don't know that. I think the knowledge of boxing history has helped me because I saw how old time managers and promoters worked. And what would George Katz had Gil Turner, Sonny Liston, Kitten Hayward. Well, look what George Katz did with Gil Turner in 1953, or how he maneuvered him, or how he got him to be such a popular guy by taking him to men's clubs and Bennie Briscoe functions and City Hall functions, and just see how they did it, or what opponents did they choose, things like that. Katz always said, see if it's the right fight first, then worry about the money. That was one of the first things I learned from him. And
let me ask you this: so you've been around, I mean, thousands of boxers. Of all the boxers you've been around, I know your affinity for Bennie Briscoe. He is a legend. He's amazing. If you had to rank your top 5 boxers that you've had personal contact with, who would those top 5 be? Or can you make a top 5?
You mean my 5 favorites?
Yep, 5 favorite fighters
that fought for me.
Yep.
Well, of course, Bennie Briscoe, Jeff Chandler. These are Marvin Johnson. My wife says all the old timers.
Not new ones.
Well, I'm going to leave people out. There aren't. If you want to talk about modern guys, I mean, Gabe Rosado has that same mentality. I mean, you would go into the gym and it'd tell Jeff Chandler we're fighting so-and-so, and he'd say, can't you get me anybody better? Okay. Today you go into the gym and you say, we're fighting so-and-so. They say, he's too tough. I need 2 more fights first. So those 3, I got a great kid now named Jason Sosa, who's a
I
former.
like him a lot. I saw him fight once. He's
I
a
mean,
he's a brawler.
To win a world title in 2016 at that stage of my career in China was got to be one of the top 10 highlights of my career. I'm just looking around the room.
It's pretty cool that you have all those photos. If people don't know what's behind you, those are fight photos.
I got four floors of this. Charles the Hatchet Brewer was tough to get close to, but he was never in a bad fight. Another guy who really a wonderful guy, probably a better person than a fighter, but a hell of a fighter, was Tony Thornton, the punching postman. Well, stories I could tell you about him were just, some of my top stories. I don't know. Maybe you can think of some I've missed, but Frank the Animal Fletcher.
Yeah.
More exciting than him.
So not everybody understands these names. Not everybody understands the history of boxing, and nor do I expect them to. But I want them to appreciate the passion that you have for the sweet science, for the nuances of booking a fight and making matches and getting fighters who wanted to fight every day because that was their goal was to become a world champion one day, and they wanted to fight any fight that was put in front of them to prove that they were worthy. Now, I'm a huge fan of guys that'll just stand and go toe to toe.
Sure.
And I'm going to have Mickey Ward on in a couple months. And for me, the single greatest fight I ever saw personally, not live, but on video, was Ward Gotti. 1 and 2 and 3. They were all good. What were you there for that fight? Number 1, for any of those 3, and number 2, if you were, what was it like to watch at ringside?
I was at Ward Gotti 1, the best of the 3.
Yep.
And I was actually involved with both guys at different times of their careers. Ward Gotti 1 has to be on my top 10 all-time greatest fights in person. I only count them if I'm there in person. So, you could watch the 9th round 100 times. How many times? Where are you going to find a better round? You know what's equal to the 9th round of that fight is the last round of Corrales Castillo.
Oh, that was such an amazing fight! Wow.
So, and I was at
that fight turned so many different times in that one round. Like you thought Castillo was down and out, and you thought Corrales was down and out. I mean, it was just an amazing to get up. People don't understand how hard it is to get up. If you watch a football player get tattooed and he lays on the ground and he's out, and they take him to the blue tent and he's done because of concussions, right? There's no such thing as that in boxing. You can have a concussion from the first round and you're fighting until that fight's over, as long as you're willing to stand up and take it. And that's the beauty of the sweet science of boxing, is that it's a testament to courage, to heart, to the ability to not get hit at times, a la Floyd Mayweather. The reason why he is undefeated is because he hasn't gotten hit that much. His defensive tactics are amazing. I don't think he's that great of a boxer per se. I'm not a fan of his style of boxing, but his defense is second to none. And I look at a guy like Bernard Hopkins, who I think is kind of like a mix of an old school fighter and he's got a little bit of the Mayweather defense where he doesn't get hit a lot. What are your thoughts on Bernard at being one of the best Philly fighters ever?
He's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's going to go down as one of the best Philly fighters ever. I think his biggest strength was his mental strength. Bernard had a mindset of the old-time Philly fighters, but he had it in an era where nobody else had it. In other words, I don't know what kind of success Bernard would have had. I don't know if his mental games would have meant anything to Bennie Briscoe or George Benton, whether they would have gotten upset by it. I doubt it. I always say to myself, could the best Bernard Hopkins beat the best George Benton? I don't know. But you got to give it to him. I mean, come on, longevity at the top. That's how you measure greatness. It's longevity at the top. People come into the business, whether they're fighters, managers, or promoters, and they're successful for a short period of time, but it's over the long haul that determines whether you're, a Hall of Famer or not. Longevity. And he had
Now,
that.
he's part of Golden Boy now.
Yeah,
And
he has a minority interest in Golden Boy, yeah.
does he do much active promoting, or is he more of just a face kind of guy, a guy that's out in the front when they need somebody out in the front?
Yeah, from what I know, he's more of a face. I've never, in all the times I've dealt with Golden Boy, I've never dealt with Bernard. I've never negotiated any deals with him. I
can tell you now, for people that don't know, I was, for about 3.5 years, I was a manager and trainer of a boxer who we won't mention, but that's how I got to know Russell. And yeah, in that very small window of time, walking into it blind, knowing nothing about what I was going into on the manager's side, I was very frustrated on both ends with dealing with the promoter for my fighter as well as dealing with my fighter. What are your struggles that you have with today's fighters as a promoter? Obviously, the willingness to fight or not fight has got to be one of them. But is it a different today dealing with the managers and fighters versus the managers and fighters of yesteryear?
Oh, it's not even. It's a different world. Back then, the managers managed the fighters. Today, the fighters manage the managers. Fighters talk like managers. We'd go into the gym and I'd say to Quenzel McCall or Sam Solomon, you can fight, Cyclone Hart can fight this guy, or George Benton can fight this guy, or we can make this match with Roland Marshall or whoever. And you would get it. Now and then you would get a rejection. But you contrast that with today. I could say now and then you get an agreement today. I mean, today they turned down 9 out of 10. Back then they would maybe object to 1 out of 10. Everybody, there was no internet, there was no YouTube, there were no films. Nobody had video of guys. You would just call people in different parts of the country and ask their opinion. And my main question every time out, if I didn't know much about a guy, I'd say, does he fight like Joe Frazier? So if he fights like Joe Frazier, I want him. I don't want him to fight in later years. I would say, does he fight like Joe Frazier? Does he fight like Michael Nunn? Because if he fights like Michael Nunn, I don't want him. I don't want a runner. Listen, I love Pernell Whitaker, and I enjoy watching him fight, okay? But I don't want to watch a whole show of Pernell Whitaker fights. And nobody does. No, I don't care what anybody says. Everybody wants to see somebody get clocked. That's why they go. At a hockey game, you don't see two guys going out there and jabbing and ducking and, moving around. They're standing toe-to-toe. That's what people want to see.
Why is it, do you think, is it just because of the money? Is it because of fame and ego that there's not as many? I watch boxing constantly, and I very rarely see a fighter fight. Like, I don't see two guys that are willing to just step into their wheelhouse and just see who's got what. Everything is about 1-2 out, 1-2 out, 1-2 out. And it's very frustrating. What is it just a cultural thing? Is it a money thing? What causes that, do you think?
I think Mayweather has caused a lot of it. I think he's to blame for it. He should take a lot of the blame because he made such a big deal out of being undefeated, and never taking, fighting guys at the right time, fighting them all at the MGM, never going overseas, probably never going into a guy's backyard. And today, everybody wants to be undefeated. Now, I said this before, I took an old Ring magazine from 1961, and there were 8 divisions, 8 guys in the top 10. So there's 80 fighters plus 8 world champions. There was actually 1 split title at the time. So 89 fighters. Out of those 89 fighters, 5 were undefeated, 3 made it to the Hall of Fame, okay? Now, I took the WBC rankings from about 2 years ago. I limited it to the same 8 divisions, same 88 fighters. 31 were undefeated. Oh. So that just tells me that nobody's fighting anybody. And I think, we've got about, I would say we have a dozen or more fighters in Philly right now with less than 20 fights each that are undefeated. But they're not fighting anybody. So you don't really, and people who go to the what people call club shows, anything that's not televised. And even a lot of fights that are televised, a lot of the shows are cowboys and Indians. You can look at the lineup sheet and see who's in what corner, and right away you know who's going to win, what corner is stacked that night. It's all about getting a win and moving on to what they think is pay. You know, every high school player doesn't make it to college, and every college ball player doesn't make it to the NBA. So someone's got to tell these guys, you know, and manage them correctly. You have to know what you have. Otherwise, you're going to invest in a fighter, and he's going to get to 20-0, and all of a sudden you've spent all that money, and then he comes in his real first fight, and he hits the guy, and the guy's still there, and he said, "What am I going to do now?" You know, because guys have been falling down for his previous 20 fights. So I think Mayweather fostered a lot of that, and there's such big money at the top. The problem is that percentage is so small. Let's say that 5% of the people in boxing are generating 95% of the money, and the other 95% of the people in boxing are generating 5% of the money. The problem is, in that 95%, they think they're going to get there, and they're not going to get there. And these managers I see these guys, the thing today is they buy fights. They'll call me up and say, "Can we put our kid on your show? We'll bring our own opponent. We'll pay for it." So a lot of promoters fill their whole shows with guys like this because it cuts down on expenses. And guys are out there paying $50 and $75 to come to the fights in a time frame when people are complaining about spending $12 to go to the movies. So that's why we're still looking at National Guard armories and catering halls, while football, basketball, baseball, and ice hockey are building multi-million-dollar stadiums, because nobody's getting a bang for their buck anymore.
Yeah, I noticed. I went down Jimmy Lang down in Maryland, and as much as Jimmy Lang is not a highly talented boxer, what I can tell you is that he puts on a show. When he was boxing, you want to talk about a guy that's willing to just stand and get his head beat in and then deliver the same back. To me, it was worth going down and seeing those shows, because he was a guy, and his dad was, a great guy. I loved his dad. His dad's a great guy. They would put on such an amazing show, though, that it was worth the price of admission.
Right.
And I think they found a nice little niche there, because people love to go and watch people. Everybody wants to look at the 7-car pileup that they're driving by. They say they don't, but everybody looks. Everybody's looking for something, like, is somebody out of the car bleeding? Somebody wants to see that. That's just nature. That's the way it is. And if you go to a boxing match, you want to see two guys bang their heads around. And,
right.
And I don't want to see Mayweather fight ever again. I liked Pacquiao early on, but now they're all in the same vein of hide and go seek boxing. I guess the question I'm going to ask you next is, where did you see the change happen? When did boxing become less about boxing and more about entertainment?
Probably the turn of the century, the turn of 2000. The first the nail. People say I'm a pessimist, but when USA Network went under for boxing in 1998, that was a big blow for boxing on a lot of fronts. One, USA Network did business with a host of different boxing promoters from different venues around the country. It wasn't like Top Rank has ESPN all tied up today. Heyman has Showtime all tied up in Fox. Eddie Hearn has DAZN, that app. Competition was better, and it just made the sport better. Boxing was still big when Tyson was around, and even into the De La Hoya years. But I don't know, something happened at the turn of the century. For me, the Blue Horizon, when I got to watch what I say here so I don't get sued.
Yes.
When I left the Blue Horizon in 2001 because I could no longer get along with the landlords, I didn't want to leave, but sometimes the money just isn't worth it when you're not enjoying the people you're around. And that stage of my career, I started with the arena, then went to the 70s. The 80s was Atlantic City. The Blue Horizon, I thought that they would 2 out-of-towners in the main event and still sell out because people loved the fights at the Blue Horizon, and it didn't matter who was fighting anymore because they knew they were going to see a good show. And that's what we're talking about. You get them into that habit of just seeing good fights. So one night, Frank Gelb's son, Alan, Frank did a lot of work in Atlantic City, came to me after the 3rd or 4th fight at the Blue Horizon. We were kneeling ringside. He said, Russell, he said, you haven't cut a break for a single fighter on this show. Every fight tonight has been life and death. I said, Alan, look at the crowd. You can't even get in here. We're turning people away. And when USA went under and stopped doing boxing, and then, ESPN has been hit and miss for so long. When I got the job at ESPN in 1998, like the USA went under in August and I got the ESPN job to start that October, I remember sitting and saying to myself, all these years of making good fights finally has paid off. I've got the job that I want. I can make good fights with other promoters all around the country every week. And I wasn't into the job 1 month when it all fell apart, when interoffice backstabbing and jealousies and the people who had hired me moved on to ABC. And, it just fell apart. And even though I stayed there for 4 or 5 years, I was nothing more than a valet. That's the best way to say it. And seeing how good it could have been. And I said, let's forget about the casinos. Let's force the promoters to promote in arenas, because I always say you can't take a fighter from Boston, put him in a fight with a guy from Miami, and put him in some godforsaken casino in Tacoma, Washington. You can't do that. But the promoters are so lazy. And I did it a few times myself because the money is so good. So the instant gratification is there. But in the long run, what does anybody in Tacoma care about a kid from Boston fighting a kid from Miami? But promoters don't want to go out and tack up posters. They don't want to send out press releases. They don't want to use their ingenuity to attract people. And that really, as much as casinos have helped put money in promoters' pockets, it's hurt the business. There's a lot of casinos, if you're under 21, you can't get in. So where's the future? So I got off the track, but a lot of it's Mayweather. And a lot of young fighters look up to Mayweather and they think they can do it on their own. And that's what we're left with.
Well, let me ask you this. So that's a nice transition. We're talking about, the struggles of boxing. What role do you think MMA had, the UFC, the growth of UFC? What has that had in the lack of growth that boxing as a whole? Now we still have, the big pay-per-view fights, but the actual, I know that FS1's putting on, the fight nights, and ESPN still doing their thing. But as far as the popularity, it's very clear that UFC is winning the battle between the two fights, type of fight. So what do you think is the cause of the UFC being stronger than boxing?
Well, I think boxing let them in. I think boxing opened the door because boxing was at its best when there was only one champion in each of 8 divisions. So as the years go by, boxing increased the number of divisions and increased the number of champions. And every time they do this, the sport gets weaker. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that. So when I was a kid, I could name all the lightweight champions backward from Joe Brown in the 50s to Benny Leonard in the 20s. I couldn't even tell you who the 4 lightweight champions are today. And I'm supposed to be a historian. So if I can't tell you, if you go to an Eagles game and there's 70,000 people there, think about this. How many people could tell you who the heavyweight champion of the world is at an Eagles stadium? Do you think a dozen people could tell you out of 60,000? Don't count yourself. But when I was a kid and you went to Franklin Field to watch the Eagles, everybody knew who Sonny Liston was. Everybody knew who Floyd Patterson was. Maybe today you'll get, isn't it some guy from Russia or Poland or, it's so boxing opened the door for the UFC and the MMA. I think if boxing had stuck to the tradition, I don't think the impact would be felt. They're also promoting it better. They're spending more money on it. Boxing people look to cut expenses rather than to generate income. It's like a lot of the casinos in Atlantic City that once hosted boxing. They got all the bean counters in there, and rather than generating income by bringing in more events, they cut expenses down and they get nothing. So
that's a shame.
Wrestling was always there. Ray Fabiani's Mat Time. Wrestling was always around while boxing thrived. I think boxing did it to itself. I know a lot of people blame UFC and MMA, and I get it. But I think boxing did it to itself.
I agree 100%. I'm a fan of both. I like the fact that I know who the UFC champ is, and there's only one heavyweight champ. There's only one lightweight champ. There's only one middleweight champ. So that makes sense to me. It's a logical attraction to know who the champ is. And then intrinsically, you have your favorite fighter who's a contender who you'd like to see get a shot and maybe one day get a shot at the title. So that makes boxing more intriguing to me. I mean, UFC more intriguing to me because, quite honestly, the thing that does annoy me is that there's so many different the WBC, the WBA, the IBF, the IBA, the UBO, or whatever else is out there. There's all these crazy different organizations, and obviously there's only four that really matter in boxing, actually. But even those, it's watered down, and it takes the fandom part away. It takes the who's the champ? Am I following Tyson? When Tyson was the champ, there was only three at the time, I think. Probably, I don't think there was four at that time.
There was the WBO came aboard in '88, and a few years later it was taken seriously.
So I think that star attraction, that feeling that you have a shot, that one person's a champ and you got the 10 contenders, you fight your way up to where you move up in the rankings and you get your shot. And I just don't think that exists anymore. I think there's a couple nice fighters that are doing some good stuff. The Charlo brothers, I think that they have potential. And I think they had the ability to bang with others. I don't know if they're going to get managed that way and be allowed to do that. But I think they have that ability. I think Canelo has that ability. Once again, he just got big money, so who knows what he's going to be doing from here on out now that he got the paycheck. But I think it's a shame that such a great sport has been watered down to almost the redheaded stepchild in the fighting sports. And it saddens me because I look at your wall behind you and I see all those great fight posters, and it just makes me sad that we can't really have those anymore.
No, because when there was only one champ, in order to get a shot, you had to fight number 8, then you had to fight number 6. Now you got 4 champs to choose from, so you move up by attrition because this guy gets a shot. Okay, you're moving up. This guy gets it. Okay, you don't. So why can't you make the fights you used to make at the Spectrum? Well, that's why, because nobody wants to take that shot. And the other thing is, suppose at the end of the basketball season, the NBA, there's no playoffs, and the Warriors say we're the champs, or the Celtics say no, we're the champs. That's what boxing is. It's a sport with no playoffs, and it's a shame because when you look at the scrapbooks that I've inherited of just the Philly, there's a guy named Chuck Hassan who was born the same date and the same year I was, December 9th, 1946. He's a boxing fanatic. I asked him what was the first fight he went to. His dad took him to the same fight my dad took me to.
Wow.
Isn't that something? So he went to the Philadelphia Free Library, and he wheeled into my office one day about 10 books of all the major, covering all the fights in Philly from like the turn of the century till today. And when you see the even in my time, the press we used to get, the people that went to the fights, it was such a big deal. Listen, from the beginning of time until 1958, there were only 3 pro sports that mattered: baseball, horse racing, and boxing. 1958 was a sudden death game, which brought the NFL in. When I was in college and the Sixers won the title, it was on tape delay, you know, and there was no ice hockey in Philly until 67. So boxing was so big. If we didn't get with the 3 papers, the Inquirer, the Daily News, and the Bulletin, we'd get 4, 5, 6 stories in each paper before a fight. Of course, now nobody reads the papers, which is funny because back then those guys made fun of me going into a dying business. Well, theirs died quicker.
Well, yeah, you're still standing, still making fights.
Yeah, hanging in there.
So I'm going to transition a little bit. I know we've been spending a lot of time talking about boxing. You and I, we share a similarity in that we both love boxing, but we've also lost somebody very close to us. And I know how that loss of a sibling was for me. And I know from speaking to my mother and my stepfather what it was like to lose their son. I know that your son recently passed, and I want to send my condolences to you for that. But I would wonder if you would just share with people who your son was and why he was so important and why he's so missed.
Matthew was 38 when he passed away in May of 17. He was our firstborn son. He was handsome. He was brilliant, though he rarely studied. He was very street smart. He had 8,000 girlfriends, of which I was jealous. I remember the day he got his acceptance into University of Oregon with like on each of his college boards was over 6. He looked at us and said, "Ha," meaning look what I did without studying. And he I don't know if you know what the birthright program is. Every Jewish boy or girl upon reaching the age of 17 or 18 is entitled to an all expenses trip to Israel. And he went to Israel and he fell in love with it, and he became an Orthodox Jew, in the strictest sense. And he married a girl from Toronto, and they had 4 kids. And it was just, I'd always hear, Linda would always say, she'd bring up someone, "Oh, see that woman over there, she lost her son," or this one lost, and I don't, geez, how can you live with something like that? And then, it happens to you, and sometimes you feel guilty just having a good time. Why? Or you drive by the old neighborhood, or you see a picture on the wall, and it doesn't get better.
No.
How can it get better? You'd have to be made out of stone for it to get better. And you focus on all the good times, and I don't know. It's just, that's why I'm hoping, because none of us really know. And I said this at the unveiling of his grave a year after he died, that when I was a kid, I went to see Carousel with Gordon McRae and Shirley Jones. It was like the first grown-up movie I'd ever seen. And the opening scene in Carousel it's a scene from heaven with the blue sky, and they're walking on clouds, and Gordon McRae's in the front, and he's on the top of one of those step ladders, not the kind you lean against the building, you know, the kind that open up in a V, in an inverted V. And he's sitting on top with lucite stars, and he's hanging them on invisible hooks in the sky. And every once in a while, he looks down to see what's going on Earth. And I'm hoping that that's what heaven is like, because you know what? When you really want to get deep into it, how are we here? Well, how did life begin? Is this the only life in the galaxy? Nobody can say what's going on. Who knows? How did we get here? So I'm hoping that that's what it's like, and that he's up there hanging stars and having a good time with my sister, who passed away when she was 67. So, you know, about 10 years ago. That, I don't know. I don't know how you get it through it. Yeah, I guess when you don't think about it, when you start thinking about it and dwelling on it, it really gets rough.
Well, here's my thoughts on it. You know, it's been 30 years coming up this year that my brother passed. In July, it'll be 30. I went through a 13-year period of depression after my brother died. And I just, you know, the PTSD is simply when your brain gets shocked by a traumatic event and you can't handle it. That's all it is. It's whether it's in combat or it's losing a child or losing a brother. PTSD is just simply the inability to cope with a traumatic event. And I went through that. And I didn't know I was going through PTSD at the time, but I went through it. And I didn't handle it well. I was very difficult for me during those 13 years. I had a moment of God's grace in 2002 that allowed me to come out of that. And what I've been doing ever since is trying to find ways to find my purpose. So when my brother was alive, he was autistic, I mentioned to you, and he stuttered, and I was basically his protector. And for 13 years, when he died, I'd lost my purpose. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to replace it with police work in the military, and everything I did, protecting something, it just didn't fill that void. And it turns out that my purpose is just to continue to share my brother with the world. And someone asked me, why do I get emotional every time I talk about my brother when I give an inspirational talk? And I said, it's because I want to feel him. Like, I want that. I don't want to run away from that emotion. I don't want to run away from the fact that I feel sad or I miss my brother. That's my connectivity to him. That's how I know he's still here. And that I find comfort in that. Because if I didn't have it, because when I went through that 13-year period, all I felt was anger. I didn't have that longing, missing, feeling, loving component to me. So for me, the missing him, the sharing stories about him to emotional is something that I find myself being proud of, because that's me being able to share my brother with somebody.
No, I understand. I think it's good to talk about it. I think I have incredible guilt. And people say, go see this guy. Go see this doctor. He'll cure you. I said, you're not going to cure me. You know, nobody's going to tell me how I should feel. I feel how I feel, and that's what it is. It's just, you know, you can go. I don't know if a day goes by where I don't think about my son, but you know, I go out to walk most times every morning, and certainly then, and certainly when I'm driving any distance in a car by myself, you know, or whenever I'm in the old neighborhood, it's just, it's never going to get better. All you can do is live with it and accept it, and that's it.
Well, the reason why I wanted you to share that is because I think it's important to put that out into the atmosphere, and I think to put that out and share that with other people. Well, at some point in time, someone's going to watch this and connect with you on some level about that. And as much as I love boxing, as much as I love talking about old boxing matches and the history of the sport, I also know that this show is meant to help people, and it's meant to inspire some people. And I think the fact that you've lived such an epic life, you've done all these things, and you may not find it epic, but from the outside looking in, I'm in awe of the career that you've put together and the things that you've experienced, things that you've seen. I wrote, when I named my company, I Got You, is because everybody always told me when they needed my help, I would always say, I got you. And the tagline for my company is living a life of selfless service worthy of remembrance. And the reason why I wrote that is because at my brother's funeral, he didn't have anybody that I ever knew of come to our house and ask him to come out and play or call our house or anything. He didn't have friends, but he worked at a camp every summer when he was in high school cutting grass. And somehow he connected with a bunch of people that every summer, so much so that when he died, there was about 1,000 people at his funeral.
Mm.
And I remember I was in such a haze because I was suicidal in my head and had a lot of things going on. But I just remember thinking, who the hell are all these people? And it turns out the brother that I knew was not the same brother that was out that camp. He was an open, loving, warm, didn't need protecting. He was just safe. So I want to live a life like you're living a life where when you finally pass on, and God forbid it's in 30 years, I want you to live to 100. But when that happens, people are going to have a big church filled with people that are going to say, Russell Peltz was a good man and he did a lot of cool shit. He saw the world. He saw things that most of us would only dream of seeing. And that's kind of the way I live my life. I want to live that life. I want to share this, people like you, with the people who are watching this today. That's the goal. That's everything about 2 Dates and a Dash is living out your dash. And my friend, you've done it. You've crushed it. And that wall of amazing memories and the photo albums and the crap that's stuck in your head that you haven't even figured out how to pull out yet. That's the stuff that's going to make life amazing for other people, because they're going to reflect on your life and say how important you were in their life. So that for me is what I find impressive about being able to do this show and have people like you on. We can talk boxing all day long, but it's the reality of the man and what he's able to accomplish in the time that he's been given, whether it's 21 years or your son's life, whatever it is. Making the most of that dash is important. So with that being said, thank you for coming on my show.
Hey, my pleasure.
Is there any shows you got coming up that you want to tell everybody about? I'm sure they're at the arena or they're at parks or wherever they're at.
Well, we have a big show that's just about sold out February 8th at the 2300 Arena in South Philly. Then March 1st, we have a show at the Parks Casino in Bensalem. March 15th, we got a world championship fight at the Liacouras Center at Temple with Tevin Farmer. I believe he's Philly's only world champion right now. And we're close to closing a show, another world championship fight 2 weeks later at the 2300 Arena on ESPN. And I can't pronounce his name, the kid that just knocked out Adonis Stevenson for the light heavyweight title, trained by Teddy Atlas. It appears he's going to defend his title March 30th at the 2300 Arena. So even though I want to slow down, I've got a busy month and a half, 2 months coming up.
And where can everybody find tickets for the show, learn out more about the different shows that you have?
The best thing for them to do is just call the office. Oh, maybe that's somebody now.
Hey, it might be a ticket sale right there.
Just call Peltz Boxing at 215-765-0922.
And what's your website, Russell?
PeltzBoxing.com, but it's really not, it's not up in, my webmaster disappeared a few years ago and I've never really gotten it back together.
But there's some good information on you and the history of your promotions and stuff like that on the website.
Yeah,
right?
But you know what? I've been writing a lot on Facebook lately. So if they follow me on Facebook, that's probably where most of the stories have been in recent years. Well,
my brother, I just want to thank you for being on the show. We had some, just so you know, we were having some technical difficulties before the show, and it got down to the last minute, but we got it all figured out and worked out. It's been a pleasure.
We knocked them out in the 15th round of a dead even.
We weren't sure we were going to get there, but we got up every round. I appreciate you being on the show. I appreciate your willingness to do the show, and hopefully I get down to one of the shows and we can catch up again. But thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. It was a pleasure.
Everybody, thank you again for listening to another episode of 2 Dates and a Dash podcast. My name is Matt Cubbler. I'm your host, and thank you again to my special guest, Russell Peltz. Have a great evening, and for God's sakes, be kind to one another.